in the past, of course, there has been a stereotype of conflictual relationships, in that there were various wars of religion, and because history is loaded with event-oriented descriptions rather than development-oriented descriptions. That is, events attract the attention of historians. Events get written down, memorized, celebrated, discussed, analyzed, and developments, silent developments, don't. And so one thing is noticed and the other is not. Today in our news, of course, the things that would be noticed would be, you know, like some kind of bombings or so-called terrorist incidents, etc. Whereas the fact that so many Muslim women returned to wearing the hijab or head covering, as indeed my wife and her sister and her mother did on their own against the opposition of all the males in their family who didn't want them to cover up, that is relatively ignored. It's not completely unfeatured in any of our media, but it's not emphasized, although it's a much more important development that has affected a far larger number of people. And that is not only because of, there may be indeed some bias in the press that wants to paint Islam and a bad picture of Islam, but on the other hand, it's also just that events attract attention, and all the history books of all countries are filled with this event-oriented history versus developmental-oriented history. And of course, in the last 50 years, there has been a vast change of emphasis toward more development-oriented history, and that has successfully played out to some extent on the European historical area, but there's still a lot of work to be done on other historical areas. So if you study the history of Islam, the history of India, the history of China or Japan, you're going to get a lot less social history than, in proportion, than you would get from Western history. That's almost for sure. And the result of this is also, as far as the Muslims in the West go, to the extent the Muslims were not in pre-modern times located in the West, to the extent that they were a separate civilization, an independent thought universe living apart from the European thought universe. Of course, painting events usually paints bad relations and leads to this classical stereotype of war. Now, I think that Karima was talking to you about the Muslim contribution to the Renaissance and so on, and that is the other side of it, which is the more developmentally oriented side. Because in spite of hostile relations across borders, there were always friendly relations also, and that is something that needs more emphasis, especially if we are to cultivate the idea of pluralism in our educational system. That is, that there were lots of cultural contacts that went across the supposed boundaries of hostility and led to nurturing exchanges of ideas that furthered human civilization altogether. And so that is something in the past that is important to observe, and I will be sufficed by what Karima has told you on that and move on so I can concentrate more on the present as I'm speaking to you today.